My name is Colin Barr, and on behalf of the Keough-Naughton Institute for Irish Studies at Notre Dame and the Keough School of Global Affairs at the University of Notre Dame, I am delighted to welcome you to the second webinar in our series of Transatlantic Conversations on the next generation of the peace process. We are very, very pleased to co-host this series with the University of Liverpool's Institute for Irish Studies. And it is my task this afternoon, and it's a great pleasure to do so, to introduce and extend a warm welcome to our guest moderator for today's event, Claire Sugden MLA. Now, Claire Sugden, as I don't need to tell most of us, is the longest serving independent MLA in Northern Ireland, the only elected independent in the Assembly. At the age of 29, she was appointed Northern Ireland Justice Minister, at that time, one of the youngest government ministers in the world. She is an alumna in 2010 of the Washington Ireland program. 2 years later, in 2012, she was there as a manager and mentor for the program. Now, in addition to her keen interests in Northern Ireland's devolution and in good government in Northern Ireland, she's long been a powerful voice and an advocate for specific legislation dealing with domestic violence, a process she began during her tenure as Minister of Justice and that reached fruition just this year in the Domestic Abuse and Civil Proceedings Act of 2021. She's also been a powerful voice and advocate for mental health and in the dealing and analysis of trauma and issues that arise from Northern Ireland's particular past in that regard. All of this makes her, I think, absolutely the perfect person to moderate this second event. And it's a great privilege to introduce her and welcome her on behalf of Notre Dame and the Keough School of Global Affairs at Notre Dame. Claire, I will pass that to you.
Thank you, Colin, and good evening to those joining us on this side of the Atlantic, and good afternoon to those joining us stateside. It is my pleasure to moderate Transatlantic Conversation, which aims to frame better outcomes and understanding via reflective and evidence-based dialogue. It asks for practical, flexible, and creative developments that respond positively to evolving realities. The building of the next generation of the peace process requires the implementation of ambitious ideas and confident resolutions backed by investment. To succeed, it will need academic, civic, business, and political choices that embed economic prosperity. Transatlantic Conversations calls for a recognition and development of interdependent relationships between the United States, Ireland, and the United Kingdom. Transatlantic Conversations begins by exploring the perspectives of the UK and Irish government. I was 11 years old when the Good Friday Agreement was developed by the British and Irish governments, supported by the US President and signed by the main political parties. Most importantly, it was endorsed by 71% of the people of Northern Ireland. 23 years later, there are suggestions that the Good Friday Agreement has failed. Indeed, recent unrest and challenges related to Brexit certainly imply volatility. But the Good Friday Agreement has not failed. It achieved its greatest aim of bringing peace to the island of Ireland. But peace is not an event, but rather a process which is underpinned by making Northern Ireland working within the context of the United Kingdom and as a place on the island of Ireland, and also by ensuring good governance and good relationships, and that is all our responsibility. At this point, I remind the audience to ask questions using the Q&A function just below, and I will do my best to put as many of these questions to our speakers at the end. I am pleased to introduce Simon Coveney, TD, the Irish Minister for Foreign Affairs and the Minister for Defence. He was also the Deputy Leader of Fine Gael and served as Taoiseach and Minister for Foreign Affairs and Trade with responsibility for Brexit from November 2017 to June 2020. He has served as Minister for Housing, Planning and Local Government, Minister for Defence, and Minister for Agriculture, Food and the Marine. First elected to the Dáil in 1998, he was elected to the European Parliament in 2004, where he was a member of the EPP ED group. He was a member of the EP Foreign Affairs Committee and the Internal Market and Consumer Protection Committee, and a substitute member of the Fisheries Committee. Mr. Coveney was the author of the European Parliament's annual report on human rights in the world for the year 2004 and again 2006. And he was a member of Cork County Council and the Southern Health Board from 1999 to 2003. So Minister, it's a great pleasure to ask you to make some of your remarks, and you have about 20 minutes where then we will move to questions.
Thank you very much, and good evening or good afternoon, depending on where in the world you are. And it's great to be speaking with you all, even if it has to be virtually for now. In particular, I'd like to thank Claire Sugden, independent Unionist MLA, who's moderating the session. But I'd also like to thank Professor Peter Sherlow from the Institute of Irish Studies, and also Dr. Catherine Wilson of the University of Notre Dame for their invitation and their ongoing work in supporting this kind of dialogue, which is as important as it's ever been. I'd like to take this opportunity to say a few words about the peace process, about the impact of Brexit, and about the potential for a future of partnership and cooperation between these islands, Ireland and Britain, that I hope the future can bring. And then look forward to taking your questions, which I expect will be direct, knowing some of the audience that are online. First of all, you've asked the question, what does the next generation of the peace process look like? Fundamentally, for me, it remains about transforming and strengthening relationships across the three dimensions of the peace process reflected in the Belfast Good Friday Agreement, relationships within Northern Ireland and the island north and south, and east-west between Britain and Ireland also. We now have a whole generation that has been born and has grown up to adulthood since the agreement, out of the shadow of violence in Northern Ireland. That's an enormous achievement that the people of Northern Ireland, of the island of Ireland, and of Britain, and indeed of the United States, can and should take a lot of pride in. But we know that fostering a deeper reconciliation and thriving relationship is an ongoing endeavor for us all. It requires us to drive economic growth that benefits all communities, including those that have remained on the margins and have not seen the benefit of peace in the way that they should have, whether those are loyalist communities or nationalists or border communities. It requires functioning, stable political institutions and an inclusive and generous approach to different and contested identities. And we're seeing that this year. It requires an ongoing commitment to working collectively among the parties in Northern Ireland, between Belfast and Dublin, and between the Irish and British governments. It needs the energy and ideas of civil society. And I know it will get the crucial support that has helped us for decades, continuing from the United States. I was delighted to welcome the news of the nomination of Claire Cronin as the next US ambassador to Ireland, and I'm very much looking forward to working with her during her time in Dublin and on the island as a whole. I know that the administration may consider appointing a special envoy for Northern Ireland also, and I think that would be a very positive step. One lesson we have learned from the process in Northern Ireland is that peace is just that, a process, not an event, as Claire has said. Even when the agreement is signed and the cameras go away, it needs governments and political and community leaders to keep the momentum moving in the right direction, not for months, but for years, indeed for decades. And it is a tribute to our friends in the United States that you have known that too, and that we have continued to benefit from your interest, your support, and your continuing solidarity. You've stayed the course with us over many, many years, and you continue to do so today, not simply as observers, but very much as participants in the conversations that continue to take place. I know that friends in the US and across the world will have looked on with concern at the scenes of violence we saw on the streets of Northern Ireland at the beginning of April. Now, thankfully, somewhat quiet again. But with all the dramatic political developments that we've seen over the last few days and weeks in Northern Ireland, we know that calm, measured leadership and stability remains absolutely vital. I know that many of you will have particular concerns regarding Brexit and its impact on the island of Ireland. So let me address some of those issues directly. After 4 years of negotiations, the new EU-UK arrangements, including the dedicated protocol on Ireland and Northern Ireland, came into effect just over 6 months ago. Throughout the Brexit process, Ireland has had a very clear and consistent perspective. Early on, we identified our main challenges and our core principles: protecting the gains of the Good Friday Agreement, avoiding a hard border on the island, maintaining the common travel area between Ireland and the UK, and protecting the integrity of the EU single market and Ireland's place in that single market, which is so central to our economic story. They remain at the heart of our approach to the implementation of the new arrangements that are now in place. However, the shape of the EU-UK arrangements has been determined in large part by the choices made by the UK, including the UK's decision to leave the EU's customs union and single market. We respect those choices, of course, but we must also be realistic and truthful about how they restrict what is possible within the new arrangements. Both the EU-UK Trade and Cooperation Agreement, or the TCA as it's called, and the Withdrawal Agreement, of which the protocol is an integral and legal part, were jointly negotiated, jointly agreed, and now need to be jointly implemented. The protocol on Northern Ireland was a hard-won compromise, negotiated over a number of years, which attempts to minimize, as much as possible, the challenges and the disruption caused by Brexit on the island of Ireland. I understand and appreciate the genuine concerns that some have voiced. I have proactively engaged with Northern Ireland stakeholders in business and in politics on these issues, and I continue to do so, both mostly privately, but also sometimes publicly too. So too does the European Union. And the Vice President of the Commission, Maroš Šefčovič, who's the lead negotiator for the EU on these issues, had extensive outreach with Northern Ireland this week. The negotiations that led to the protocol involved commitments and compromises on both sides. We have to make it work, and it is a joint responsibility to do so. The EU has shown that it is willing to be a partner and has been open to exploring flexibilities and pragmatism within the framework of the protocol. This includes offering to work with the UK on a new veterinary agreement that would cut the level of border checks required on agri-food produce by up to 80%. That's on checks on goods coming from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, because effectively, due to the protocol, they are goods that are coming into the EU single market for goods, even though it's Northern Ireland, part of the UK, outside of the EU now. That's how the protocol works. We strongly welcome President Biden's clear message to the UK at the G7 that such an agreement would not harm the prospects of a US-UK trade deal. That's an agreement on a sanitary and phytosanitary or veterinary agreement. We hope that the UK government will consider this option, which has broad, popular and strong support in Northern Ireland, including across the political divide, interestingly, and certainly amongst the business community. There must be respect for the legally binding commitments that have been already made and signed up to. And unilateral actions go against the spirit and letter of what has been agreed, and they pose a serious risk when stability and responsibility are most needed, as they are now. We therefore welcome that, rather than take unilateral action, the UK has sought in the last couple of weeks EU agreement on extending what's called the grace period on chilled meat products, which essentially prevent trade barriers in terms of chilled meats between GB and Northern Ireland on a temporary basis as we look for new solutions. The EU has welcomed the request, and I'm confident that this modest extension to this grace period will be accepted by the EU. I also encourage the UK and the EU to use the opportunity to reinvigorate and intensify talks on those outstanding issues, which are causing some concern on the ground in Northern Ireland, to put it mildly, including the steady supply of medicines into Northern Ireland from GB, and movements of pets, which might seem like a relatively small political issue, but it is certainly a very emotive one. The only sustainable solution are those that we can agree together. Whenever Northern Ireland has been functioning well, it's been at times when the UK and the EU are working together, and when Britain and Ireland, through London and Dublin, are working together in close cooperation with political leaders in Northern Ireland. A clear majority of people in Northern Ireland voted to remain in the European Union in the 2016 referendum. Most businesses and citizens in Northern Ireland and a majority of members of the Northern Ireland's Assembly recognise the protocol as a means to mitigate the negative impacts of Brexit where it can, and therefore want it to work effectively. The protocol offers opportunities to Northern Ireland with full and free access to both the EU single market of 450 million consumers for goods, and of course the rest of the UK internal market. Nowhere else in the world has had that offer made to it in the context of remaining outside of the European Union, very much with unfettered access into the rest of the UK market, and also completely unfettered access into the EU single market. It is an enormous opportunity, but unfortunately, so far, all of the political focus has been on problems and barriers, and also the identity-related political issues that unfortunately go with the protocol debate. I want to recognise also that a thriving British-Irish relationship is vital to all of our endeavours, not just on the protocol, but on many other issues as well. Ireland and the UK will always be close neighbours, trading partners and co-guarantors of the Good Friday Agreement, and good friends also. The truth is there are very few families in Ireland that don't have close connections with the UK. As EU membership no longer brings the UK and Ireland together in partnership, we are therefore seeking to strengthen the British-Irish relationship in this changed context. As part of this approach, we're working closely with the devolved administrations in Scotland and Wales, and we will open a new Consulate General for the North of England in July. We're working the East-West institutions of the Good Friday Agreement, the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference and British-Irish Council, and the Taoiseach and Prime Minister are due to meet again in July to take forward the work of building our bilateral relationship for the years ahead. Some of the listeners might know it, but one of the realities of EU membership together was that Irish government ministers and British government ministers would have met each other regularly at EU meetings. Those meetings are clearly now no longer relevant for UK ministers, and therefore we need to replace the opportunities to meet, to build relationships, to build trust, to build partnership between London and Dublin with new structures. And we need to work the existing structures that are already in place. And I'm glad to say in the last number of weeks we've done that. We want to focus on the future and invest in it, but there does remain unresolved issues from earlier times in the process. And dealing with the legacy of the conflict is one of the most important, but also one of the most emotive and difficult political challenges that we face. We agreed a way forward in 2014 with the Stormont House Agreement. We reached that agreement with the British government and the Northern Ireland parties in 2014, with the exception of the UUP, but all of the others were very much on board. Unfortunately, that has still not been implemented. So at the British-Irish Intergovernmental Conference last week, both the Irish and the British governments agreed that there is a need for a process of intensive engagement in the period immediately ahead with the parties in Northern Ireland to make progress on this critical issue, which is so important for so many families that are deeply scarred and still suffering from their experiences years ago. Where there are concerns, we must address them. We may bring different perspectives to the table, but where changes are being proposed to the Stormont House Agreement, and they are, not by the Irish government, but by others, they must be considered and agreed by both governments and all the parties. it is clear that only through a collective approach can we hope to deal with these sensitive issues comprehensively and fairly, and that victims and their families must be at the heart of this process at all times, and not any other political considerations, whether they be in London or Dublin or anywhere else in Northern Ireland. However, we also want to continue to build a positive shared vision of the future. That's why last October, the Taoiseach launched the government's Shared Island Initiative. This is about looking to the future on the island of Ireland in a positive, inclusive, and open way that involves all communities and all political traditions. People have very different and equally legitimate perspectives on the constitutional future they want to see for the island of Ireland, whether they are nationalist, unionist, or do not identify with either tradition. The agreement validates and legitimizes both constitutional paths, and people are fully entitled to advocate for and work for either vision, as long as this is done through exclusively peaceful and democratic means. Through the Good Friday Agreement, we definitively resolved how we decide on the constitutional future of the island, founded on two carefully balanced principles: the principle of self-determination for the people of the island of Ireland, north and south, acting without external impediment, and the principle of consent, namely that it is for the people of Northern Ireland to decide their constitutional future, and it is for the two sovereign governments to give effect to that choice should they make it. The genius of the agreement is that this guaranteed framework for constitutional issues enables us to work together in our common interests without in any way compromising our different identities and beliefs. That's what makes the Good Friday Agreement so powerful and so successful. We can work for a prosperous, inclusive, and reconciled home place for everybody. The government's Shared Island Initiative is bringing a focus and a higher level of ambition to working on that shared future, now and for the years ahead. We want to deepen civic, cultural, educational, business, and political links on the island to foster better connections and mutual understanding. Our focus is on the island of Ireland, but there is also a valuable East-West dimension to be acknowledged and harnessed as part of that project. To back up our commitment, the Irish government in the budget last October created a Shared Island Fund, making €500 million in capital funding available out to 2025, which is ring-fenced for North-South investment and joint projects. Our Shared Island Dialogue series is bringing stakeholders together from across all regions, communities, and traditions. Dialogues have been held online in recent months, including on climate and biodiversity challenges, the equality agenda, and on economic recovery on the island of Ireland. I, for example, led a recent and interesting session on civil society cooperation, North and South, opening up civic dialogue to a range of perspectives and issues beyond traditional lines is an important and constructive dynamic, very much in the spirit of this discussion we're having today. So in conclusion, it is essential that we can come together and openly discuss our ideas and thoughts on issues of critical importance to the island of Ireland. It's essential that we have the discussions people, including young people, want to be having, not simply rehearsing familiar arguments or closing ranks along traditional lines on the basis of identity or history. And importantly, it's about listening to. So although there's much more I could say, I will conclude there, and I look forward to hearing your ideas and answering your questions. And I would encourage you to be frank and to be blunt, and I will certainly try to return the favor in terms of giving direct answers to direct questions. In short, I am optimistic for the future. I'm somebody who is in many ways steeped in British-Irish relations. My own personal story is an example of that. Much of my mother's family live in the UK and are the most British people I know. I've been to university in England. I've worked in Scotland. One of my brothers employs over 11,000 people across the UK. As a Minister for Agriculture, I was deeply involved in many partnerships between Ireland and the UK. So believe me, I'm not an Irish person who is in any way anti-British, but my job is to ensure that Irish interests are understood and respected in the UK, and that when we have challenges like we have had in recent years in the context of a decision that the British people have made in the context of leaving the European Union and all of the disruption that causes, my job is to make sure that an Irish perspective is understood and respected and is part of the solutions that we design and generate and sanction together to try to protect people's lives, to try to avoid disruption, and most importantly, to try to protect a peace process that so many of us still feel so invested in terms of trying to ensure that the next generation who are growing up in Northern Ireland, and indeed in border counties south of the border too, are not impacted and scarred in a way that their parents were by the breakdown of relationships that resulted in such violence and trauma in the context of the history that we share. So many challenges ahead, but I believe with positive and brave leadership at times, and with the extraordinary support that we continue to get on the other side of the Atlantic, we can not only protect a peace process, but we can build on that. And we can move on a pathway to reconciliation that I think can be hugely rewarding for people of all backgrounds on the island of Ireland. So thanks very much, Claire, and I look forward to the questions.
Thank you, Minister Coveney. I appreciate your comments. I suppose from the outset, you talked about the success of Northern Ireland since the signing of the Good Friday Agreement 23 years ago. And I really want to acknowledge and appreciate that, because I do think Northern Ireland has had significant success, not just in terms of securing a peace on the island of Ireland, but I think also in terms of the prosperity and the opportunities that we have taken hold of, not least with our own tourism, within our digital economy, and all those other successes, within Northern Ireland. I think too often there tends to be headlines around the difficulties and the volatility of Northern Ireland. But, I think certainly in its 100th year, I want to celebrate, our successes and building those so that we can look forward to the future. So I suppose there were some of the remarks that really kind of resonated with me was your comments around we have to go from a period of transition to a period of transformation. And certainly I believe the best opportunity to do that is to ensure good governance. And that isn't just within the context of Northern Ireland and what the Northern Ireland Executive is capable of, but also those relationships, both north-south and east-west. So I suppose I'd be keen to hear your views on how we strengthen that, not least mindful of the fact that it was only in January 2020 that the Northern Ireland Executive was restored after a period of 3 years of no government in Northern Ireland. And, some of the opportunities that we lost within those 3 years, or the delays, as a consequence of that. So how, as a co-guarantor of the Good Friday Agreement, where the institutions are a core part of that agreement, does the Irish government intend to support Northern Ireland in moving forward in a way which is about good governance rather than good politics?
Gosh, well, first of all, I agree with all of that. I mean, I think if governments and political parties were to allow the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement to collapse, and let nobody be under any doubt, they have been under extraordinary strain in recent months and years, then I think, the one foundation we do have for a peace process, which is structure, institutions that guarantee north-south interaction and, for the most part, cooperation, that guarantee devolved government through government, that guarantee joint government in an executive that involves nationalism and unionism and also others, that guarantees east-west relationships as well and pulls the two governments into solving problems in Northern Ireland. Those structures have been enormously important during the strain of the Brexit process. I believe if the Good Friday Agreement hadn't been there as a foundation for cooperation and dialogue and interaction, I think resolving many of the issues that we managed to find compromises on would have been much more difficult. So yeah, I think you know, lesson one is let's protect what we've got. It's not perfect, but it is a foundation that we need to build on and protect. Secondly, you know, I think relationships have suffered in recent years between parties in Northern Ireland, between parties in Northern Ireland and the government in London, between parties in Northern Ireland and the government in Dublin. There have been real strains, for the most part linked to Brexit issues and now issues relating to the protocol, but other issues too. I mean, don't forget, it took 3 years, as you say, to get the devolved institutions in Northern Ireland up and running again. I spent a lot of time in meeting rooms in and around Stormont for nearly 2 years. I was in Belfast virtually every week or every second week. And the issues that prevented us from getting agreement, if you're looking from the outside, if you're looking from the US and you ask me the question, what took you so long? If I was to explain what the issues preventing agreement actually were, people would struggle to accept that. But when issues that look relatively small from afar are translated into totems for identity in Northern Ireland, particularly around issues around language and culture and legislation around that, which really did delay agreement for a very long time, you begin to realize actually just how fragile relationships still are, even more than 2 decades after the Good Friday Agreement. So I think the most important thing that we can try and do as a government in Dublin, working with the government in London, is to try to protect what's there, but also to try and find ways of improving relationships and rebuilding trust that has been damaged. That is the main thinking behind the Shared Island Initiative. You know, we're putting a significant amount of money in place to work jointly with the executive in Northern Ireland and with the British government to fund projects of mutual interest that hopefully can result in more positive political conversations, rather than it being dominated by COVID, by the protocol, by difficult issues on legacy, by non-delivered commitments so far on the agreement that was the basis for getting the executive back up and running, called the New Decade, New Approach Agreement. There are so many problems to solve in Northern Ireland. We've got to create positive narratives too, so that relationships can be rebuilt, and that we can generate the kind of leadership that has the confidence to be able to compromise and take risk to solve many of these problems.
Absolutely.
So this is an ongoing challenge, and you know, we are heavily engaged in it, and I know many people on this call are watching each step of that engagement quite closely.
Yeah, no, I appreciate that. And, you know, you talk of relationships, and one of the most significant relationships, and indeed a facilitator in the peace process, has been the relationship with the United States. So at this point, it gives me great pleasure to welcome Representative Richard Neal. Congressman Richard Neal of Massachusetts has served in the US House of Representatives for over 30 years. In 2019, his colleagues elected him to the esteemed position of the Chairman of the Ways and Means Committee. He is co-chair of the Friends of the Ireland Caucus. Congressman Neal has received many awards and honoraries degrees in his career, including an honorary degree of Doctor of Laws from Ulster University in Northern Ireland. So, Congressman Neal, I would be delighted if you could make some comments and perhaps ask Minister Coveney some questions.
Sure, thank you very much, Claire, and certainly thanks to Notre Dame. And I always appreciate the clarity with which the minister speaks to very complicated issues. So very, very grateful for the firm positions he's taken through these negotiations. I think that we constantly, as you highlighted, Claire, need to remind ourselves of the success of the Good Friday Agreement. It brought to an end the longest standing political dispute in the history of the Western world. Always a reminder of what the North looked like 30 years ago. You couldn't travel anywhere without helicopters, watchtowers, a heavily militarized police force, and 30,000 British soldiers in an area the size of the state of Connecticut. The people on both sides of the border at that time overwhelmingly voted for a new day, and the American dimension was indispensable. So I think that as we've discussed the Good Friday Agreement, it's important to remind everybody that all the political parties on the island agreed to give up something to bring about the new day. So the Republic of Ireland ceded Articles 2 and 3 of its constitution, which had laid claims to the North. The Unionist parties in the North agreed to relinquish the border. And in the three strands of the Good Friday Agreement, which I was very instrumental in, we developed strand 2, which would be the Belfast-Dublin connection. And by and large, those institutions have held. So I don't know anybody who would make the argument of returning to the bad old days, but for purposes, again, of history, many of us took the position that we would do everything we could to stop the gun running that had come from the United States. The UK took a vigorous position that they would offer the United States a much more vigorous position in the negotiation. And Bill Clinton took that challenge, and days, weeks, months, and certainly hours on the phone with the key parties brought about an agreement that most would have thought was inconceivable. So I can't highlight enough that even the differences of opinion that exist now should play out in the mundane challenges that we all have in representative democracy. And I often will hear people say there are two communities. I think that the better argument is there are two traditions within one community. And all of us on this side of the Atlantic, we have resisted the entreaties from some of the hardest people on the island to return to the bad old days. But we also have pointed out that the Good Friday Agreement with America as a co-guarantor is sacrosanct. And there can be no threat to the Good Friday Agreement. And I think that the recent comments that President Biden made were very welcome. I thought that the position that Speaker Pelosi and I have taken as it relates to a bilateral trade agreement with the UK are firm. And we want to see the Good Friday Agreement through. And that means that the challenges that are presented by Stormont should simply be about arguing over schools and water rates and agriculture and tourism, as opposed to threats to go back to a different time. And the minister said something else that was very important. And that is this: 2 generations of children have now grown up in the North who have no idea about the bad old days. And they get on with the daily routines of life without the threat of who might be standing behind the wall someplace. So it's the old challenge that we find in a representative democracy, and that is when we reach our potential expands.
Okay, thank you, Representative Neil. Minister Coveney, do you have anything to respond to that?
Well, I mean, first of all, just to acknowledge the role of Richard Neil in Irish America as someone who is extraordinarily interested in the detail of what unfolds in Northern Ireland in terms of political challenges, literally on a week-to-week basis. Not only is he the chair of the Friends of Ireland in Washington, but he is somebody who isn't just keeping a broad eye on the welfare of Ireland and the relationship between Britain and Ireland and the peace process, but really is somebody who I've reached out to and have taken counsel from at different times, and continues to take an interest. And And that is because I think he and many others see this as one of the most significant foreign policy achievements in US history, in the context of being part of a peace process that has achieved so much and continues to be an international guarantor, if you like, of that process. And I think it is important that role continues. But look, I mean, let's not pretend that despite the successes of the Good Friday Agreement and how it has sustained in many ways against the odds, that all is well in Northern Ireland right now. It's not. We are all working to try to ensure that we have a calm summer, but it wouldn't take a lot to spark primarily actually young people to lash out as they did in April because of the perceptions that many have that they haven't been listened to, that their tradition isn't being respected, that they have been in some way outmaneuvered through the Brexit process and through the process of implementation of the protocol. I could go into a long sort of history lesson as to how that has come about, but it's not really helpful to be laying the blame on anybody's doorstep. We have what we have now, which is a complex agreement. We have an implementation plan for that agreement. There's a need for the EU to show some flexibility and pragmatism, and there's a need for the British government in particular to show some honesty around what has been agreed to, why it was agreed, and the disruption that it has prevented, to put a context around the ongoing discussions around the protocol and its implementation. We will start in the next few days a process of engagement on an equally sensitive issue around how we deal with legacy. So Richie will be familiar, as will others, what we agreed in the Stormont House Agreement, which was a structured approach and a funding commitment to fund those structures to try to deal with the legacy of the past in terms of establishing the truth for families, allowing families to take cases to court if the evidence book is there to facilitate that, and of course the creation of a historical narrative around putting a context around those awful years of murder and mayhem and violence. And so if we're to move away from that structured agreement in Stormont House, we will only support that as an Irish government if there is consensus around amendments to that approach that would be better than what was agreed in Stormont House. And this idea that the Stormont House Agreement is failing, nothing is happening on legacy. I mean, our view is the reason for that is that Stormont House hasn't been implemented in terms of the legislation that was promised and the funding that was committed to. But having said that, we will be part of this process to try to take forward legacy, mainly because so many families have been waiting for so long, both for truth and support, to allow them move into the space, hopefully, of some form of reconciliation. So, you know, as we said at the very start, you know, an agreement to sign a peace agreement is only an agreement on that day, and it triggers a new process that needs to be fought for and managed week after week, month after month, year after year, decade after decade. But we're very fortunate that we have the structures of the Good Friday Agreement to be able to manage today's challenges and also to look ahead to tomorrow's challenges, which of course may be very challenging as well. You know, as some people talk about a border poll in the future, what that might look like, as others reject that approach, and as many in the middle ground want to try to rebuild relations before we start talking in that context at all. So lots of perspectives, a small geographical part of the world, but an incredibly complex tapestry of political challenges that we all have a responsibility to try to play a constructive role in.
Yeah, great, thank you. If we move to some of the questions from the audience, and you talked about today's challenges and tomorrow's challenges, and one question, and you've already touched on this, is how do we address the apparent impasse over the Northern Ireland Protocol? I suppose from my perspective, coming from a unionist background, I recognise it ultimately, practically, as a trade issue. However, it is giving rise to identity issues and consent issues, which was key to the Good Friday Agreement, and you've discussed that earlier as being one of the two principles that was important to get that over the line. I suppose in trying to interpret it from people on the ground, they are seeing problems where they don't have the same access in terms of trade or even movement of their pets across the same jurisdiction, and that doesn't seem quite right. So I suppose from that perspective, how do we reassure people on the ground that they have the same access prior to the 1st of January in order to move this impasse on, so that they can feel part of the jurisdiction that they believe they were part of, certainly from 1998 onwards?
Yeah, and for the benefit of many people on this call, what the protocol on Northern Ireland and Ireland does effectively is it prevents border infrastructure re-emerging on the island of Ireland for trade. So the Republic of Ireland is part of the EU, it's part of the EU's single market, it's part of the EU's customs union. And the United Kingdom were leaving not only the European Union, but also its single market and customs union, because it chose not to be part of a shared customs union or single market, even outside of the EU. And so there was a need, because of the kind of Brexit the British government insisted on delivering, and that is their right, but there are consequences to that decision. The kind of Brexit that they insisted on delivering meant that there needed to be a Northern Ireland specific solution to prevent border infrastructure being required as trading infrastructure on the island of Ireland. And the solution effectively was that the EU agreed to extend the EU's single market for goods to cover Northern Ireland, while respecting that Northern Ireland, of course, is outside of the EU and part of the United Kingdom. And that is very clear in the protocol. There is no threat to the constitutional status. And Lord Frost has said that repeatedly in the protocol. But of course, the price of that solution was that goods coming into Northern Ireland effectively now are goods coming into the EU single market for goods. And therefore, under international trading rules, there needs to be some checking system to know what's coming in. There are no checks on goods traveling from Northern Ireland into Great Britain, because they are goods leaving the EU single market. But in order to protect the integrity of the EU single market, and this is as important whether you're in Paris or Prague or Buncrana, the EU needs to know that its single market doesn't have an unguarded back door through Northern Ireland, that goods can come in from any part of the world through Great Britain. And so the price of the protocol was a minimal level of checks on the ports in Larne and Belfast on goods coming in from Great Britain. Now, many in the unionist community have interpreted that as aligning Northern Ireland's economy and regulatory environment more with the EU than with the UK, and that undermines their Britishness. I don't agree with that, but I can understand how that perspective has developed, and many have reinforced that messaging and added a language of the identity of politics to the protocol that really has fired up many in the loyalist community in particular, who feel that this is threatening their identity. Just on the consent issue, and I think it is important to address this, because many people have said, sorry, not many, but some people have said that the protocol is not consistent with the Good Friday Agreement because it doesn't respect the principle of consent in Northern Ireland. I don't think that's accurate. It is my personal view. Let's not forget that there was no consent in Northern Ireland for Brexit in the first place. So Brexit is the disruptor here, not the protocol. The protocol was designed to limit the disruption of Brexit. So a majority of people in Northern Ireland voted against Brexit. And so if you were to follow the principle of consent, as regards Northern Ireland.
It was a UK referendum. Like, I would acknowledge as unionist, I was a Remain voter. However, I recognise that it was a UK-wide referendum.
And we respect that. And we respect that. But if you're going to quote the principle of consent in the context of the Good Friday Agreement, which is the right of people in Northern Ireland, or majority of people in Northern Ireland, to determine their own future, well, then you can't quote the principle of consent in the context of the protocol without also quoting the principle of consent in the context of the Brexit process in the first place. Because don't forget, the protocol was a decision made by the government of the United Kingdom, just as Brexit was also. And I think people do mix up the principle of consent with cross-community support for a decision that impacts on Northern Ireland. And of course, while I would think there's a modest majority still in favor of the protocol, of course, there's a strong majority amongst the unionist community that would oppose the protocol, but don't have any alternative proposal to actually replace it. So these are difficult issues, and my view is that we need to do everything we can to use the flexibilities within the protocol to respond to the concerns of business communities in Northern Ireland, and in particular, the concerns of many in the unionist and loyalist communities. And that is why I think, and there's no stronger advocate than me, I can assure you, with the European Commission to try to do that. It's one of the reasons why the request from the British side for an extension to a grace period this week is going to be supported by the EU. It's one of the reasons why the EU is coming up with solutions in relation to guaranteeing supplies of medicines that may not be certified in the EU or certified in GB, but need to be facilitated in terms of supply chains into Northern Ireland. It's one of the reasons why I think we can get solutions to pets traveling from Great Britain into Northern Ireland, where normally pets coming from a third country wouldn't be able to come into the EU easily. And it's also why I think there is an opportunity for us to reduce checks on food products coming into Northern Ireland by up to 80% by trying to get an agreement on phytosanitary and sanitary standards and veterinary agreements between the UK and the EU. So, I mean, we will continue to try to respond to those sort of issues of contention as best we can. But I have to be honest with people. Like, I don't see an answer that's credible here by simply saying the protocol has to go or the protocol has to be replaced. We spent years, literally, trying to design solutions that ultimately ended up in a British government being part of designing, ratifying, agreeing to implement a protocol which is about reducing disruption. So to scrap it and replace it, I just don't think is realistic. And I think it's important that I'm honest about that, even though some people don't want to hear it.
Okay, I'm really conscious of time, so I'm going to look to a couple more questions from the audience. And a number of questions, Gary Wilson, Catherine Taylor have talked about Irish unification, perhaps the issue of tomorrow as discussed. So a question from Gary, is Irish unification inevitable?
Do you want me to take a couple of questions at the same time, or do you want to do it one by one?
There's a couple of questions in relation to the constitutional questions. So maybe if we go with that one, and we can see then maybe one last question before we wrap up.
Yeah. I mean, I don't think anything is inevitable, you know, and I think to refer to reunification on the island of Ireland as something that's inevitable and therefore the unionist community just have to accept it. You know, I'm not sure that is a helpful contribution to a dialogue that needs to be inclusive. So, you know, I am a constitutional nationalist. I would like to see at some point in the future the reunification of the island of Ireland politically. But I also know that there is an enormous amount of work to rebuild relationships in a way that ensures that a unionist community aren't fearful of that. They may not like that idea, but but I think that many in the unionist community feel almost under siege by that perceived threat. And I think we have got to find a way of talking about unification on the island of Ireland in a way that is not threatening at its most basic. But I also think it's important to say that, because sometimes, unionists say to me, you mustn't mention a united Ireland, or you mustn't mention border polls. Yet virtually every unionist that gives a political speech talks about the defense of the union. Dreams and aspirations and ambitions for reunification are perfectly legitimate. But I think it's how we manage that debate, where we respect Britishness, we respect a unionist tradition, but we advocate through politics in a way that's generous and modern and open for what I and many others may think may be a better way of managing the politics of Ireland. And but certainly this aggressive language of Brits out as being somehow advocating for a united Ireland. I mean, I would argue that we need Brits in terms of ensuring that everybody on the island of Ireland is respected in terms of their traditions, their views of history, their sense of place, and only when we have that respectful debate can we progress, I think, the challenge and the project of reunification. And I think that needs to happen in a sequence that protects relationships.
Yeah.
But I mean, this is going to be a big political debate in Ireland. It's already begun. Brexit in many ways has accelerated that. That has caused tensions. I know that. But I think we have to find a way of addressing these issues in a way that allows different perspectives to be respected and understood, so that people don't have to hide their opinions and views, or are somehow perceived to be a threat if they outline their aspirations for the future. And it's difficult to achieve that kind of environment, given the challenges that we've faced over the last number of years, and the grandstanding and the aggression and the pressure, and the collapse of the institutions and their ongoing fragility. And we've just seen leadership changes in the two unionist parties in Northern Ireland, and I think that is evidence of the pressure that that unionist political leaders are under right now in terms of some of these questions. So timing and sequencing and respect and generosity really is how we need to take this discussion forward.
Yeah, and I really appreciated that question, particularly because of the word inevitability. And I'm glad you said that it wasn't inevitable, because certainly as a unionist, I don't believe that either moving towards a united Ireland or staying within the current context of the United Kingdom is inevitable in either way. And that for me is about the principle of consent and self-determination, where it will only be the people of Northern Ireland that decide that. And I think any conversations we have shouldn't be just about uniting with Ireland. It should also be about remaining within the United Kingdom. It should be an interdependent conversation, if you like, and a constitutional question. Because I know very often in Northern Ireland, people view unionism and nationalism as orange and green, and I appreciate the context and the history of that. However, for me, unionism and nationalism are fundamental political ideologies about the Constitution. And for me, it's contextual. So what is the best context in which to provide education, in which to provide infrastructure, in which to grow Northern Ireland in terms of its economy? And I think that's the conversations that we need to be having. It's not just about the idea that we must do this. It's about what's best for the people of Northern Ireland, and indeed the United Kingdom. So any conversations moving forward, to be truly respectful of both traditions and neither, need to recognise what's best for the people within them. So I think
the one addition I would add to that, though, is that for unification or reunification to take place requires a majority decision south of the border too. That's part of the Good Friday Agreement. But yes, I mean, that is I think that choice will happen at some point in the future. But when it does, I hope there is a context to it and a generosity around that context that can allow, if that change happens, and I would be somebody advocating for it, but I absolutely respect many others won't be. but I hope that Ireland at that point, as an island, north and south, will have come to a point where, if there is to be constitutional change, that many people mightn't like that, but they would realize that they have nothing to fundamentally fear from it. And I don't think we're in that place right now. You know, that has been reinforced by many comments, particularly coming from the unionist community. So there's a lot of work to do in this space, as well as all of the other things that we talked about earlier on in this discussion.
Okay. I've been told I can run very slightly over, so I'm going to take a question from Pauline Goldie, I think, where she's talking about policy. So rather than the politics, and kind of to kind of wind this all up and bring it back to where we started, it's about good governance. So, you know, whether we want to stay within the United Kingdom or whether we want to pursue United Ireland, we have to make Northern Ireland work, not least for the people south of the border as much as those north of the border, if we were moving toward that. So again, how do we promote good governance in Northern Ireland in terms of policy, and indeed across the island and the United Kingdom, so that it actually serves the people that it's intended? Because for me, Northern Ireland isn't a geographical place, it's as much about the people within it. And for me, we all have a responsibility to recognise, you know, what we need to do for their best interests.
Yeah, I mean, it's, you know, it's a shared home for communities that have a very fundamental difference of perspective in terms of that home and where it's come from and how it's been shaped and who's shaped that and what its future is. And I think some of the comments that I've heard from younger generations of well-known people in Northern Ireland, I think have been quite thought-provoking, I have to say. So, you know, if you listen to some people on this call will know him, some others mightn't, but you know, Andrew Trimble, who's quite a famous rugby player in Ireland, from Northern Ireland, you know, he gave a really interesting media interview a couple of months ago when he talked about his generation not wanting to have to choose an identity, and why should they be forced to, when they want to focus on quality of life and better relationships. Tommy Bowe, another rugby player, actually, who also would be well known in Ireland, again talked about his generation and different perspectives on identity, and feeling Irish, but certainly understanding the context of the Britishness of Ulster as well. So, you know, I think we are starting to see a different perspective emerging in Northern Ireland from a new generation. You know, if you look at the growth, for example, in support for the Alliance Party, who don't necessarily identify themselves as either unionist or nationalist, but have seen their support base grow and expand. And in many ways, the Good Friday Agreement isn't designed to accommodate that, as it happens, in terms of governance. You know, I think the real challenge for us is, how do we protect the structures of the Good Friday Agreement while accommodating new strands of opinion in Northern Ireland and rebuilding relationships? And as I said at the start, we've got to protect what we have, because if we lose that, it'll be virtually impossible to rebuild it. And we've got to try to work towards the rebuilding of a confidence in politics in Northern Ireland, so that we're not talking about the very survival of the institutions of the Good Friday Agreement every second month, about whether or not the Assembly can survive, the institutions can survive, but we can start taking them for granted, and focus on the actual issues that they're there to solve, as opposed to the institutions themselves. I think that would be an enormous achievement if we could do it in the next few years.
Great, thank you. I'm not sure if Representative Neil is still with us. If he is, you know, I'd be delighted to give him the last comment. Okay.
Yeah.
Okay, he's gone. No problem. Look, it really just very quickly going to wrap up because we have gone slightly over time, but I just want to thank Minister Coveney for really interesting insight and Representative Neil across the Atlantic in the United States and for their continued interest and input in Northern Ireland and Ireland. And thank you for everybody for participating and the questions. There were many of them and I didn't get to them, but I do hope that people will take those on board and see how we can move this conversation forward. I think the most key thing to all of this, and it has come up a number of times, is about building relationships, whether that's north, south, east, west in terms of Ireland and the United Kingdom, or across the Atlantic and the United States. I think for all of us to move forward, we're all in this together. So look, thank you for your interest this evening, and I hope you all have a great day. Thank you.